To begin with, I must thank the HRDC Center of JNU and Professor Sanjay Bharadwaj for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. After the strategic deficits and core concerns, we should now come to the thrust of the policy. Before we look at the evolution of the policy, I want to underline again that the foreign policy dynamics has been geared to overcoming these strategic deficits and pursuing the core concerns which are there. And in this dynamics, the resonance has to be kept with the international environment and international system, depending upon the domestic, political, social, economic developments which are taking place. And as you know, the Indian state has evolved. We are not the same as we were in 1947. We will not be the same what we are today after say 10 years or 20 years. And similarly, the international system has also evolved. It cannot be the same. Therefore, one has to keep a complete resonance with these changing parameters. But keep it in mind that in terms of our heritage, in terms of our what you call the major determinants, there is also an element of continuity. So when we look at India's foreign policy, both continuity and change have to be identified and recognized. And this is almost, if people many times say this is a complete change from foreign policy, I don't find in India's foreign policy any major break from what it has been in the past. The changes have taken place, and the changes have taken place to accommodate the changes at the domestic level as also at the international level. But the continuity has always been maintained, and we must have this in mind. So when we look at the evolving thrust of policy, the factors of continuity and the factors of change must be kept at the back of mind, and that will help us understand the policy better. As I said, due to the interaction between the state and the external environment, India's foreign policy evolution can be grouped into four major phases. And both in terms of timeline and also in terms of the leadership, we can identify them as follows. First phase was, of course, you can call as the Nehruvian phase. Nehruvian phase was the phase of founding foreign policy, establishing its roots and bases. Even foreign office has to be built up. There were no machinery mechanism. There was a legacy of the British, but largely in terms of what the new requirements were of the new nation were, it had to be built up. So the first phase lasted until the end of the 60s, you can say. Nehru died in 1964, then for a short period, Lal Bahadur Shastri came, and then Mrs. Gandhi took over. But this phase normally, in terms of broader analytical clarity, let us say that up to the end of the 60s, the Nehru phase lasted. The second phase was the phase of Nehru's successors, which started from the 60s and I would say ended by the 80s for another 20 years, Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. Here again we had a small break in the 77 when a coalition government came. But in terms of foreign policy continuity, you don't see this as a phase which is contributing something differently to the foreign policy. The third phase came after, you can call that a phase of non-Nehrus, because then from the governing scene, the Nehru legacy, not the legacy, but Nehru's successors were no longer there, and that started from the beginning of the 1990s, and I would say it continues in a very large measure even today. But let us say it broke at 2014 when Prime Minister Modi came on the scene. So that is the third phase of non-Nehrus, but this is a phase which is characterized by globalization in a very significant way at the international level, and economic reforms and the salience of economy in India's foreign policy, which was not there as much during the Nehru phase or the Nehru period, or even during Indira Gandhi, there was a concern for economy, but in foreign policy it was the self-reliance, the mixed economy, which really worked very largely. So the third phase is of you can call of liberalization, you can call of economic reforms and globalization, you can call the phase of the non-Nehrus. And the fourth one I would say is the current phase. I can call it say Modi mantra or Modi magic, you can call it. That what stamp or what characteristic features Prime Minister Modi has added to India's foreign policy. So these are the four phases which have evolved as per the interaction between the Indian state and the international context. Now let us very briefly, as I said, we cannot go into the details of these four phases, but very briefly let us highlight the characteristic features of India's foreign policy during these four phases. During Nehru's phase, it was, as I said earlier, it was decolonization, it was against imperialism, it was against wars and military alliances, and we clubbed it as a non-alignment. And with some of the neighbors like China, it was a foreign policy of peaceful coexistence. And as again, I want to repeat, we had this Afro-Asian mobilization of the decolonized country, newly independent countries. So non-alignment was the main umbrella under which India's foreign policy evolved. And again, I want to repeat it, that a major feature of this policy was that India was, in material terms, was powerless. We did not have much of a military power, we did not have much of an economic power, but by diplomatic mobilization, we aggregated the power of the powerless and started influencing the shaping of international order in a very, very significant manner. And it was in this significant manner that I have repeatedly said earlier also, India's role in Korea, Indochina and Suez was very important, which was needed by the major military blocs which were there, and it was highly appreciated by all of them. India also raised its voice on nuclear disarmament, on bridging the Cold War divide which was there. When it comes to Nehru's phase, there is a strong criticism which is being labeled that Nehru was driven more by ideological considerations, by the values that he talked about, peace and disarmament and non-military alliances and all that, and therefore he missed out on the realistic aspects of India's interest, and therefore we messed up in case of Pakistan, in case of China, so far as Tibet was concerned. I think this is a debate which will continue with us for a very long time. But we must look at these issues in the context in which these issues took place, not from the parameters or scales of today. Pakistan, for instance, yes, he took it to the United Nations, but he thought this is a new institution which has come up, and he had faith that this institution would be objective. He missed out on the point that the great powers will only work to their interest. The whole idea was that after the Second World War, when United Nations was constituted, everybody expected United Nations to be an overarching, a super organization which was committed to bring about peace and order in the world. And it is with this hope that Nehru took the Pakistan issue to the United Nations, and of course got caught into the great power politics which was there, and vitiated the whole question of Jammu and Kashmir. Similarly, in case of China, militarily we could not resist. The Chinese walked in Tibet very surprisingly, and there was no way we could resist the Chinese. Secondly, with the alliance system being what it is, the West had opted for Pakistan and were building Pakistan in this way. Therefore, not to be isolated, Nehru had to bring about the question of peaceful coexistence. But let us be very clear, at no time Nehru had any great faith in China's peaceful efforts. And he always knew that China on the border issue was wrong, was aggressive and assertive. And mistake or blunder which Nehru committed was that he thought with these differences China would not resort to military action. And this is where he failed to assess the Chinese, there is no doubt. Again, this is not the time to go into the history. Even within China, it was a divisive decision whether to have a war with India or not. Mao carried the day for his own reasons, and there were reasons more than the boundary pressure. China was getting isolated in the superpowers. In 1962, detente was being worked out between US and the Americans, and the Chinese were very worried about it. So they were against the status quo which was developing in the world and wanted to disturb that. So there were reasons which were beyond border in the Chinese military action. So let us leave it the Chinese action there. But we must understand that there was the fingers were always crossed. We must also recognize that despite the fact that Nehru was talking about peaceful coexistence with China, he did allow Dalai Lama to come to India. And he also allowed Dalai Lama to establish a government in exile. Now, for instance, if we put India into Chinese position, if somebody would have taken some of our dissentiers and rebellious groups and established a government in exile in some other country, how would we feel? So therefore, Nehru took a great risk in terms of what you call keeping Chinese influence and Chinese assertion contained in one way or the other. He also, we must recall his forward policy, in which he thought that whatever is the inheritance on the border given to him by the British, like McMahon Line, he would defend it. And in order to defend it, he carried out a forward policy to which Chinese took an exception, and the war really came up. So Nehru, despite the peaceful coexistence, despite withdrawing from Tibet and Xinjiang, did allow Dalai Lama to establish a government in India, and also carried out a forward policy which was not very acceptable to the Chinese for their own right reasons or wrong. He also, I mentioned to you his visit of 1949 when he was talking about alliance with the US. It did not come up because the US did not want an equal relationship with India. US wanted a subordinate relationship with India. Mind it, all those people who today are talking about alliance or very close strategic proximity with the US forget the fact that today US is giving lot more respect to India and recognized India's position in Asia than what it did in 1950s during the Cold War. They were depending heavily on Pakistan, not on India, and largely, and under those conditions we could not have accepted a subordinate status so far as the US is concerned. So in these questions of ideology and realism, so far as Nehru's foreign policy is concerned, my only submission is that we must look at the hard facts and look at these hard facts in the context in which they evolved, rather than judge them from the context which is completely changed today. The second important phase in India's foreign policy was of Nehru's successors, particularly Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. And I must say there was some shift in terms of a grandiose vision of the world which Nehru had and wanted to play a role and shape the world. There was more emphasis on the real concrete issues nearer home under these two foreign policies, and therefore there was a greater emphasis on neighbors and extended neighbors during the foreign policy pursued by India during these two Nehru successors. And they also wanted to overcome, because this Nehru's successors came up in the face of three conflicts which India had faced: 1947, 48, 62, 65. And therefore, it was necessary to overcome the security dimension of India's foreign policy, and that came up very clearly in 1971 in Bangladesh, where we faced the whole world in a very resolute manner. So Bangladesh established or bridged a certain gap in the security deficit which was there, while Nehru had bridged a gap in the disconnect with Asia and Africa, which was there during the colonial period. And whether you call it ideological or otherwise, but this is a fact. During Indira Gandhi's and Rajiv's period, the neighborhood emphasis came up also in a big way when the integration of Sikkim took place in 1975. I think it was a master stroke of diplomacy, where no guns were fired really, and a whole state of Sikkim, which wanted to become sovereign and independent from its protocol status of earlier, as had integrated willingly by the people of Sikkim into India. This was also the time when, after 1962, India started opening to China. Mrs. Gandhi had started that process, and Rajiv Gandhi carried it out further by making a visit in 1988 to China. Mrs. Gandhi had also demonstrated India's nuclear capabilities in 1974, but there were international pressures and she could not carry it forward in the sense as Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 1998 carried it by stressing that India was a nuclear power, and this is how it carried. Further, Rajiv played a role during Rajiv Gandhi's played a role in the Cambodian peace. He went into Sri Lanka, the IPKF experience. He went into Maldives. Therefore, you find a lot of activism in the foreign policy at the neighborhood level, which was not to that extent visible in Nehru's period. The third phase, which can be called the post-Cold War or non-Nehru's phase, was of redefining relations with the great powers. Soviet Union had got disintegrated, was a great friend, was a great supporter, but no longer as influential as it was earlier, and therefore redefining relationship with the US opened up as an opportunity, and India tried to get slowly closer to the US, and we have seen that what you call the strategic proximity between India and the US has increased in a very important manner. And I'll take this point further in a short while in the fourth phase because it has reflected more there. With China also, we started opening up to China. As I said, Rajiv Gandhi went there, and it was decided that despite the continuing problems on the border and dispute which we have there, we must continue our cooperation in other areas. And confidence building measures were built up. 1993 to 2005, we had 3-4 agreements of confidence building measure, how to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. And later on, it was decided that we will work together. Trade grew between India and China to the extent that today China is one of the largest trading partner of India. And on many of the global common issues like that of environment, pollution issue, the question of energy, we are willing to cooperate, and we have cooperated with China in several ways. We also started reconnecting with Asia, which Nehru had started, but in a more vigorous way. And there was the question of the Look East policy, which later on became Act East policy, where we linked up ourselves with ASEAN. Gujarat Doctrine came up to say how we must engage with our neighbors in which we should not talk of reciprocity and go more than the halfway to meet our neighbors and their major concerns. We also started more activism in SAARC. Earlier we were slightly slow on the SAARC, but later on, and also started addressing Pakistan question. Recall Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit to Lahore in a bus. We wanted a bus connection. Later on, Manmohan Singh opened up a back channel with General Musharraf, and they had almost agreed to come to a final agreement between India and Pakistan, but then Musharraf was thrown away and nothing really came up. But back channels were worked and some solution of the Kashmir problem, of the Indo-Pakistani problem was sought. Under Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 2003, the ceasefire had been agreed to, which has now been violated by the Pakistanis in various ways. But it was a great development that India and Pakistan would maintain the sanctity of the line of control. As I said earlier, this was the period of globalization and economic liberalization, and economy came forefront on the foreign policy, where we started mobilizing, enhancing our trade and investments from outside. And as a result, India's economic growth enhanced, almost went up to the 10% or so, and as a result of this, our military capabilities also started growing because of the economic resources. The last phase of foreign policy is, as I said, Modi mantra or Modi magic. It is a very strong stamp of personality of Prime Minister Modi, which has come up, and he has bring about not on the substance, but in terms of the conduct of the policy, very major, very significant changes. One of the change was of extensive visits played by the Prime Minister. I think his predecessors had not visited many countries for 10 years, 20 years, but he has gone about. Prime Minister Modi is known for what they call the Hugo Plessy. Personal rapport he has by hugging major leaders, by establishing a personal rapport with them. He has also opened informal summits, which we had two with the Chinese President Xi, and introduced a lot of abbreviated formulations and concepts. Like when he went to Bhutan, he said B for B, Bharat for Bhutan and Bhutan for Bharat, which means underlining a very close relationship with them. He also talked about neighborhood first, a new definition of relationship with the neighbors. He elevated the look east policy to act east policy, where more of an action and active cooperation with the countries of Southeast Asia was underlined, which has now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, taken the shape of an Indo-Pacific, and we are emphasizing it there. He has talked about the Mausam project, how the environment is deciding our strategic relations with the East, and he has also talked about Sagar, security and growth for all the region, which means extending the Vasudev Kutumbakam concept. So very many new dynamic active concepts have been introduced into the conduct of foreign policy. Then we also see a lot of emphasis on professionalism. And if I give an example one typical example that comes to my mind is the selection of Dr. S. Jaishankar as the foreign minister. He did not belong to his party. Dr. S. Jaishankar is not a political person, but a professional person. And from foreign secretary, this is a unique example, unprecedented, where a person from foreign secretary level has straight away been chosen to be the foreign minister. We have earlier example of Natwar Singh, but Natwar Singh had left the foreign service, and he had joined the political party of Congress and become personally closer to Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and then he came only as a minister of state, not as a full-fledged foreign minister. This example of Dr. Jaishankar is a very clear example of Prime Minister Modi going beyond his party and choosing a professional, a very qualified professional to lead the foreign service. You can also say Mr. Doval's selection, National Security Advisor, is an emphasis on professionalism. This professionalism now has been carried out in restructuring the Ministry of External Affairs. There are new divisions like Indo-Pacific, like the one which monitors on the developmental assistance to our various neighboring countries, and addressing what you call the delivery deficit, coordinating with various projects which are there, which were pending. They have all been energized and pursued further. New concepts have been introduced in terms of institutional changes which have taken place, like the military diplomacy and now the vaccine or the health diplomacy, where we are going beyond that. And I'll again refer to it in the soft power. The third major feature which you find during Prime Minister Modi's contribution to foreign policy is the strengthening of the economic dimension. That economic dimension was introduced during the 1990s and also during Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Dr. Manmohan Singh, but Prime Minister Modi has emphasized it by introducing concepts like Make in India and Made in India. And now, of course, Atmanirbhar Bharat, which he is talking about, is actually emphasizing on the economic aspects. So you have a great deal of what you call enhancement of the economic consciousness in foreign policy. Very important, significant contribution has also been the front loading of the soft power under Prime Minister Modi, where the civilizational ties, yoga, diaspora, democracy, these concepts have been brought in here. And it is from here that you find that what you call the vaccine diplomacy or humanitarian disaster relief like tsunami or earthquake relief or supplying water to Maldives, and all these issues which have come up, which are not of hard concern and hard power considerations, but they are very, very important. The last aspect, which I would say is a part of the current contribution to India's foreign policy, is an spillover of domestic political agenda in foreign policy, like the impact of some of the domestic regulations, like the constitutional amendment on the citizenship issue in Assam, which is there in relation to countries, some of the neighboring countries. Removal of 370 articles in Jammu and Kashmir and breaking them up has almost aroused an international interest, and many countries and many groups have started engaging with India on this issue. And sometimes the communal relationship also affects the India's foreign policy. So you have these 4 phases in which I have just underlined some of the major aspects of these 4 phases of the evolution of foreign policy. Having come to this, we must now look at the major challenges to India's foreign policy, and I would list 2 major challenges to India's foreign policy here. One is the managing balance between China and US. We have always had a very critical approach to India-China, US-China balance. As I mentioned to you earlier, we had peaceful coexistence with China when US was not willing to engage with us any significant way. And now China is offending us, asserting against us in various ways, and therefore we have a greater strategic proximity with India. But both US and China are critical for our relations, and we are trying to work it out with them in that manner. Now, as a result of this, because the balance and relationship between US and China is changing, they are becoming rivals of each other, they are becoming intensively competitor of each other. that we also find some of the assertion of China uncomfortable to us, US declining its role and wanting many other countries to come and play, that our strategic proximity with the US has increased. And this is underlined in the three major foundational agreements in terms of military cooperation, and which is almost taking India to the level of a NATO ally for the United States. And they say it is a non-NATO ally, but at the same level which has happened. This is a major development which impinges on what you call India's strategic autonomy. And there is a debate in the country whether we can maintain our strategic autonomy by so closely aligning ourselves with the US. I think this has been done because while keeping a close proximity with the US, we are also nursing our relations with Russia, which had a very important role. We also have other minilaterals and multilaterals where the dependence on the US is not there. Like we have a triangular relationship between Russia, China and India, and we have annual summits. We are also members of the organizations like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or what you call the BRICS, which are very different and gives us a lot of space in engaging with other countries. So these multilaterals, minilaterals, and our effort to diversify. Recently, for instance, India participated in the naval exercise done by Iran and Russia. And you know that the US is so hostile both to Iran and Russia, but we have gone forward. We have also managed our relations with Iran, somewhat difficult, but despite the US pressures that we should not be. So we are trying to maintain this balance while nursing, while encouraging and evolving this strategic proximity with the US, and the US question is there. Now, the problem is that the Chinese bilateral challenge is formidable to us. And in this Chinese bilateral challenge is formidable because they have come very close to our neighborhood, and they have a new agenda so far as our neighborhood is concerned. And in Indo-Pacific region, in South China Sea and Indian Ocean, the Chinese are militarily asserting themselves much more than what they were doing, and therefore we must somehow resist that. And we are trying to do that in various ways by getting closer to Japan and countries like Australia. As you know that we have a Quad relationship in which 4 countries, US, India, Japan and Australia are getting together, and largely to see that Chinese undue assertiveness and expansion in Asia should be taken care of. So this is the first major challenge to India's foreign policy, to deal with the factors of US and China, and particularly in the context of Indo-Pacific. In fact, we have also managed our relations with the West Asian countries in a very significant manner, where we have today quite a warm and active relationship with Israel on the one hand, Iran on the other hand, Saudi Arabia on the other hand, other Emirates which are there, and keeping ourselves distanced from the conflict, Palestinian conflict which is there. So there is a lot of careful calculation which is being carried out. The second major challenge is of the neighborhood resilience, and we find that in our neighborhood we have a lot of turbulence. The constitutional and political issues are very uncertain, and we have to take a position there. We have to take a position to assert that nothing happens which causes greater instability and greater disturbance so far as neighbors are concerned. We have got directly involved because even if we don't want, the neighbors would drag us in. I remember a phrase which is being used that neighbors and India are lodged into each other's intestines, which means that anything which happens in the neighborhood would affect us, and anything which happens with us will affect our neighbors. So we have to get very, very, very close. And particularly because the Chinese economic and strategic push into our neighborhood is so hard and so attractive to the neighbors that we have to compete intensely for that. There is no way of taking a casual approach to our neighbors in a very significant manner. Nepal is changing, Sri Lanka is changing, and we have to find it. Lastly, I would say, how can we have a real answer to India's foreign policy lie, to my mind, in three things. One is that it should be interest-driven, issue-based alliances we must have with great powers and regional major powers. We need not appear to be close only to one country, one specific country or another, but what we can do is to have alliances with as many countries as possible, depending upon our interest and depending upon the issues of our priority, the issues of relevance to us. Secondly, we have to accommodate the neighbors by becoming very resilient towards them, and that resilience is necessary in accommodating the neighbors. They expect a lot out of India. Sometimes their expectations are unrealistic, unreasonable, but we have to assess them. And at the same time, we should not appear to be unduly interfering into their internal affairs, because a stable neighborhood is critical. There are problems there because of their identity, there are problems because of their state building and nation building, but we have to work on that. And lastly, I would say that building comprehensive national power is, no foreign policy can succeed if you don't have capabilities in the economic field and in the military field, in the technological field, and in terms of human resources. So on all these four fronts, we have to step up our own capabilities. And once we look at this vaccine diplomacy, for instance, that today we are in a position to supply vaccines to the whole world, and that creates a lot of clout for India in terms of, similarly, even to many of the neighbors, the health services, they come to India for hospitals, surgeries, medical treatment. Now these capabilities have technological capabilities. US IT industry will face a serious problem if Indians did not went and work there. So these are your technical capabilities which have been built up by the institution. Economic growth, we have to recapture it. The corona period has shattered it badly, but whatever happens, unless we have comprehensive national power in which we can project our military capabilities and economic capabilities abroad in a very significant manner, the foreign policy would not succeed. Therefore, these three areas of managing great powers, managing our neighbors, and managing our own comprehensive national power are critical to the success of any foreign policy. By and large, India is doing very well. There are areas of caution and concern where we must take note of, as I said, spillover of the domestic politics, or sometimes neighbors getting alienated from us, sometimes we being forced to have a resort to, like in Galwan and Ladakh, a military face-off. These are the issues which will tax our foreign policy, which will burden our foreign policy in a different way, and we have to find out reasonable answers to them. Thank you very much.